Hey Pixel fans, Ozkai here, and today I'm going to show you how to pixel grass. So what I'm first going to start out doing is I'm going to create a new file here in Photoshop, and I'm going to make this a regular tile size, just one tile. So I'm going to make it 64 by 64 pixels at 72 pixels per inch. Now, you don't need to use Photoshop. You can use something like Graphic Scale or even Paint if you wanted to, but I use Photoshop, so that's what we're going to stick with for this tutorial. So first I'm going to bring up my swatches over here so we have some colors to work with. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to zoom in pretty far into this tile. And when I fill this with color, let's find a good grass color right here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go to Window, Arrange, New Window. That's going to give you a second tab up here. And I'm going to drag that off. And you're going to see it's going to pop up here, this same file, in a new window. So this is how I preview what I'm working on in a regular size while still being zoomed in to do my actual work. Grass is pretty easy, actually. There's just a few tricks to it, and once you get those tricks down, you know, it's like riding a bicycle. You'll never forget. It'll be very simple, very fast for you guys to continue to complete grass. The first part of this is pretty simple. What we're going to do, I'm going to find a lighter color over here. Let's try something like that. And I'm going to come over to my canvas. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually just going to, let me make a new layer over here. And I'm just going to start to draw some leaf blades. And what I mean by a blade is, you know, if you go outside and you look at some grass, you'll see some pieces of grass kind of sticking up and poking up larger than other pieces of grass, and that's what I'm referring to as a blade here. So you'll see it coming up here in this 100% view. You can make these blades as large or as small as you want. It really just depends on the type of style that you're going for, really. So if you're doing something a bit more fantasy oriented, you could do larger blades of grass, maybe like this. Or if you're doing something realistic, maybe you're going to want your blades to be a little bit smaller. So this is pretty good. You know, it doesn't have to be perfect. In fact, if you notice, things in nature often aren't perfect. So we don't want our shapes to be perfect as we do this. We want it to be, for me at least, my style is, I want it to be a little bit fantasy oriented, but I also want it to be realistic enough to be believable. So here's what I have, and what I just did is I went through what would be the center, which would be right here, the center of that blade, and I put this little, it looks like a crease, right? And it looks like a crease because what we did is we erased some of the bright parts to give it a little bit of shadow is what this is going to look like. So you want to do that with your slightly larger blades of grass because it's going to give the illusion of the grass kind of bending over, if you will, because, you know, grass, if you look down here, grass doesn't just stand straight up like this. I mean, it can, depending on the type of grass that you're going for, but what we're going for right now is kind of an organic, natural grass that, you know, blows in the wind and that you would find, you know, if you just were to walk outside right now. What I typically do is I will bunch this grass up, usually into groups of 3, 4, or 5. There is no magical number. What I usually do is I go by how it looks. So again, you know, as I draw here, I'm actually looking up here in this window to see how I like how this is turning out. So I think that's pretty good for this clump. What I mean by clump is you don't want your grass tile to just be, you know, this type of grass everywhere. So for instance, you can see this grass up here. We don't want it to look like that. Now, when I say that, that's a personal preference, and the reason that I say that is because it's too much for the eye to handle. What we're doing when we draw pixel art is, you know, we need to guide the player's eye to certain areas of the game map that we're creating. And typically, in most scenarios, ground or any type of, ground tile, including grass, isn't something that you really need them to be focusing on. We don't want to create something that is overbearing. When I say a clump of grass, I'm talking about, a few groupings, we'll call them, that are around this tile. One thing to keep in mind is I have a grouping of 3 blades right here. I don't want to create another grouping of 3 blades down here, because then we're creating a pattern. And what humans do is we look for patterns. We like patterns. It makes us feel safe. So any type of pattern that you have in your pixel art, somebody is going to notice. This probably won't be on purpose. They're not going to realize that they're noticing this pattern in the tiles that you're creating, but we will notice a pattern, and that's one way in pixel art, by using patterns and breaking patterns, that we can actually call attention to specific tiles if we need them to pay attention to it. So you'll see this grouping down here. I'm just going to do 2, and I'll probably put one more grouping over here. Maybe I'll do 5 blades of grass. And you can see I kind of do have a little bit of a pattern forming in the way that I'm drawing these. You can see that they're always leaning particularly to the left or to the right. And there's only so many ways that a blade of grass can actually fold, so that's not too bad. You can see how we talked about grass standing straight up before, and I'm kind of doing that in this one, but it's not standing entirely straight, so we need to give it some type of bend so that it doesn't look unrealistic. But I'm going to draw this clump here with a bit smaller leaves over here, but still make it look like a grouping. Now, something else to notice is in these groupings, they typically have a center point where it looks like all the blades of grass are coming out. So let me take a red right here and kind of show you what I'm talking about. Is this area is where these blades of grass are coming out. And then this area is where these blades are coming out. So you kind of want to have a focal point of where all these blades will be stemming from in your group. It helps make it look uniform and believable. Okay, so here's my groupings. Just 3 groupings on this 64 by 64 tile. What then do we fill the rest of this space with? Well, there's a few ways that you can do it. Some video games actually leave all this blank, and they just keep it this one solid color. That'll draw your eye more towards each grouping. In my opinion, that makes it a little bit easier to tell that it's a repeating pattern, but that isn't necessarily a bad thing for some video games. Again, it all depends upon your preference. What I do is I actually create small little blades that I use between the big ones. So right now, I'm going to take my little blades, and by little, I want them to be less than half of the size of this big blade. So I'm just going to begin to fill up some of this space with smaller blades, and again, you kind of want to keep a focal point where you can. And you can see that these shapes are all going to be very similar. They all look kind of pointed. Some of them have this little indent here, kind of like we have on these, but just much smaller. You're just giving the illusion of something. You don't need to always fully draw it out for it to look correct. And these small details here, they're going to get lost most likely in the rest of your map anyway, so you don't need to spend hours on this grass tile trying to get every little pixel correct, because it's just going to blend in to the rest of your map in the end. And there's no right or wrong amount to fill this grass up, really. What I'm going to do right now actually is I'm going to be kind of lazy about it, and I'm going to take this layer and just start to copy it. Now again, the more you do something like this, the more likely it is people are going to notice that there's a pattern. But if you're in a rush, or you simply know that the tile is going to be generic, there's no need to make it different than all the other tiles, then this is something that you can do. what I'm trying to do, I'm trying to not cut off any of the pixels right in the middle of the tile. That's something that you want to keep in mind as you do this, because we need the tiles to fit seamlessly. And with that being said, what we also need to do is we need to make sure that we draw some of these smaller blades right up against the edge. And the reason we need to remember to do that is because it's often easy to focus on the center of a tile and forget that, when we tile this right next to each other, we're going to end up seeing large gaps of white space here, because when they're sitting right next to each other, all this white space begins to pile up. So just make sure to draw some of your grass blades or groups next to the edge. So the last thing that I do for my grass is I add some shadows to the grass, and where I add the shadows largely depends upon where the blades are folding, because I want to bring some definition to these groupings. I'm not giving it a lot of hard contrast, meaning I'm not always putting the dark right up against the light. What I'm doing is giving it kind of a buffer, so you see this middle color. There's actually middle color between these two. When you put some contrast here and you put some shadows here, it starts to make it more believable that the grass is actually coming up out of the ground and folding over one another and the ground. Now, you don't need to put shadows if you don't want to, and you can go crazy with shadows if you want to, or you don't have to add them at all. What you can also do is some negative space. By that, what I mean is you can actually make some of these pointed or squarish type leaves out of the shadows instead of highlights. So we would want to make this type of shape this color, so we need to put the shadow around it, kind of like this, so that the shape in the middle looks like this highlighted shape. Now, there's an easier way to put these shadows in here and to really add some depth to this piece without having to go through and individually, kind of color shadows around each blade. What I do is I come into this kind of white space area over here, any place that there are currently no blades of grass, and I start to color that in with some of the shadows. So what this starts to do is it begins to give you some depth, meaning to say grass, even though it's on, say, a flat plane, is not going to be specifically flat per se. You're going to have some areas of the grass actually kind of sink in a little bit, and our shadows are going to make it start to look like it's sinking in a bit instead of just being like a flat plane. So what you should do is you should sometimes bring the shadows right up to the light in this instance. But remember, the closer you bring it to the lighted areas, the more focus it's going to bring to that blade of grass. Keep your lighting in mind. Is your light coming from the very top, or is it coming from the left or the right, or even from behind? When I do my lighting is always coming from the upper left. That means my shadows are going to be kind of behind the blades of grass right there. So now what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to take this middle color right here, and I'm going to start to draw little blades of grass into the shadows that I just made. So again, this is what we did earlier. We're just doing it in a different way now. And what we're doing is we're still simply breaking up all the monotony of this solid color. Now, another thing to keep in mind is all of the small details that we're adding here, they don't all need to be smaller pieces of grass. If you're not going to use the highlight color, what we can do is take this mid-level color and make blades of grass that are actually as large as our grouping pieces. Now, the reason that we can get away with that and it look okay is because we're using this mid-tone color. that means there's not as much contrast between this mid-tone color and the dark and the light, which means our eye is not going to pay as much attention to this. So we can put these bigger details in here and it not be overwhelming. Also, when you're doing details, not all of the pieces of grass need to be coming out from one place in a group as we did with our groupings before. So you want to kind of mix up between if you're doing larger pieces of grass or smaller pieces of grass. And I wouldn't recommend putting large pieces next to other large pieces. I would recommend buffering them out with some small pieces in between. And you can always get rid of these shadows in some areas if it doesn't look right or you just don't like how it looks. Again, it all comes back to playing around with it and seeing what works. What I always tend to do is I always tend to add some darker shadows towards the top of these groupings. The reason that I do that is because it's going to bring more contrast. You can even see how different it is here. It's going to bring more contrast to the groupings because now we have this dark against the light. And I do want these groupings to be, I want them to stand out more than I want the small details to stand out. So that's why in this instance it's okay. But you can see with the smaller pieces of grass over here, I'm not putting them right up against the dark because I don't want them to stand out as much. So the last thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to add some highlights. Now you can stop here, you don't need to add any highlights, but I do tend to like highlights on my grass. What I'm going to do is I'm going to add highlights just where the larger pieces of grass start to curl over. So right on the tops here. And what I am going to do is I'm going to go right to the edge with these highlights. This is going to help show that the grass is folding over onto itself. And when you do this, make sure that you're creating kind of these pointed areas because that's where this fold, this crease, is coming over. So we need to make sure that we show that fold even through the highlighted areas, not just the shadow areas that we created earlier. And on the smaller pieces of grass here, you probably want the highlight to be a bit smaller than it is on the larger pieces. What I'm going to do is I'm going to show you what I've already created with this type of style that I'm showing you right now. This is the grass for my current project called Dreamland. And so I created this grass the same way that I just showed you how to create your grass. This, of course, just has more time spent putting in shadows, highlights, and the midtones. So grass is a very easy concept to do, and after a little while it's very easy to master, but it will take a little bit of time to get your first grass tile correct. So you can see that it obviously took me much longer to create this grass tile than it did to create this one. So that's it for this tutorial, guys. Keep checking back for more tutorials in the future.